Mythological tortures brought to life. By now, the Colosseum is well awake in our imagination. We've seen gladiators tossed at half-starved lions, and we've drifted through the legal machinery that made all of this possible. Tonight, let's wander into a particularly strange corner of Roman entertainment. The moments when the myths of old weren't just told on stage, but acted out on living bodies. You see, the Romans didn't always want to fight. Sometimes they wanted theater, but because this was Rome, theater meant something closer to a slow-motion execution. The line between performance and punishment blurred. It's one of those details where you can almost feel the senators congratulating themselves. Why just kill someone when you can kill them creatively? One popular theme was the story of Orpheus, the tragic musician who tried to charm the underworld. In more civilized societies, you might expect a gentle play, with a man strumming a lyre and pretending to calm wild beasts. But in the arena version, they'd send in an unfortunate prisoner dressed as Orpheus. He'd hold his little instrument, maybe even pluck a few trembling notes, while real, very hungry animals were released. The beasts, as it turned out, were not particularly charmed by music. The crowd found this endlessly amusing, because of course they did. Then there was Icarus. You know the tale, the boy who flew too close to the sun. The Roman adaptation was a little less metaphorical. A condemned man was strapped into crude wings, hoisted up on some mechanical contraption, and sent gliding, or crashing, down into the arena. The punchline was usually his landing, staged with spears, nets, or a pit of wild animals. It was myth brought to life, and promptly brought to death. Another grim favorite was Hercules. Audiences loved seeing the hero's labors replayed, especially the final one, Hercules burned alive on a pyre. But in this retelling, there was no hero and no divinity, just a criminal, tied down and set alight while the crowd applauded the authenticity. In Rome, art was nothing if not literal. Sometimes, entire myths were staged, like a live play. The punishment of Dirce, dragged to death by a bull, was recreated with all the flair of a tragedy, only the actors had no chance of surviving. And because Romans adored details, costuming mattered. Victims were dressed carefully to match their mythological role. Even their deaths were scripted. What's striking is how normalized this was. For us, these spectacles read like horror. For them, it was an afternoon of cultural enrichment, like watching Shakespeare, but bloodier. Myth wasn't sacred, it was material for execution. Let's drift gently on, because of course, the Romans didn't stop with myth. When simple beasts and borrowed stories grew dull, they found even stranger ways to keep their audiences entertained. Gladiators forced to fight, starving beasts. Our focus tonight is on a peculiar Roman tradition. Gladiators forced to fight, starving beasts. A form of entertainment that was considered, in its time, thrilling, but which now, with the luxury of distance, seems more like the ancient world's version of, we have officially run out of good ideas. The Romans called these matches venationes, beast hunts. At first, they were supposed to be demonstrations of Roman power. The empire stretched across Africa, the Middle East, into forests and deserts full of creatures most Romans had never seen: lions, leopards, crocodiles, elephants. The kind of animals that, to a citizen of Rome, were more myth than reality. So, naturally, the emperors thought, why not import them, starve them for a few days, and then see what happens when they meet a man with a sword? And it was never about fairness. The animals were deliberately underfed to make them hungrier, wilder, more unpredictable. The gladiators chosen to face them weren't always volunteers either. Many were prisoners of war, criminals, people who had annoyed the wrong senator, or simply those unlucky enough to be chosen as the day's disposable entertainment. Imagine it. The gates creak open. A man walks into the glaring sun, armor gleaming just enough to make him sweat. The crowd leans forward, thousands of eyes fixed on him. Then, with a roar and a rush of air, the trapdoor opens, and a lion, hungry, disoriented, furious, lunges out. It was meant to be exciting, a contest of man versus nature. But in reality, it was often chaos. Gladiators didn't always win. Animals sometimes refused to fight, and the audience, predictably, grew restless if the entertainment didn't meet their expectations. Some emperors leaned into this spectacle more than others. Take Titus, for example. You may remember him as the one who finished the Colosseum. celebrated its grand opening in 80 CE with 100 days of games. During those 100 days, thousands of animals were slaughtered. Lions, tigers, bears, even hippos. By the end, the Colosseum floor must have looked less like a stage and more like a butcher's yard. But for the Romans, this wasn't waste. It was a demonstration of wealth and control. The empire could capture, transport, and display creatures from the farthest edges of the known world. It was propaganda, dressed up as entertainment. Then came Commodus. Of course it was Commodus. He couldn't resist joining in. He liked to fight animals himself, though always under the safest possible conditions. He once boasted of killing 100 lions in a single day, which sounds impressive until you realize the lions were released one at a time, and Commodus stood at a safe distance with a bow. Hardly heroic. But the problem with using animals as entertainment is that they rarely cooperate. A tiger might cower in a corner instead of attacking. A bear might wander off and sit down. The crowd would boo, impatient. To make things more exciting, organizers tried tricks. They starved the beasts for longer. They used whips and fire to drive them forward. Sometimes they chained gladiators to posts so they couldn't run, ensuring the animal had an easy target. And then there were the hybrids of cruelty in theater. A criminal might be dressed as a mythological figure, say Prometheus, then chained while a hungry bear was let loose. Suddenly, it wasn't just punishment. It was art. The audience could flatter themselves that they were watching culture, while actually just watching a mauling. Yet, for all their attempts at control, the arena had its own unpredictability. There are stories of animals turning on their keepers, or rushing into the audience, creating panic. Lions leaping into the stands, elephants breaking through barriers. The line between spectator and spectacle sometimes blurred in ways Rome's organizers hadn't planned for. And perhaps, the strangest thing of all, many Romans seemed to tire of it. Not all, of course. But as the centuries dragged on, the endless parade of animal slaughter lost its novelty. By the later empire, writers were already rolling their eyes at emperors who kept staging these tired spectacles. It was as if even the Romans themselves started to sense that forcing a half-starved leopard to fight a bewildered man wasn't the pinnacle of culture after all. So tonight, as we drift off, let's picture the Colosseum not as a place of noise and blood, but as it is now. Quiet, empty, the arches standing in the dark, grass growing where sand once lay, the beasts long gone, the gladiators forgotten, and the empire's endless need for distraction faded into silence. And maybe, in that silence, we can hear a lesson. That the search for spectacle is always fleeting. That what once seemed glorious can, with time, look a little ridiculous. And that even the loudest crowds, eventually, grow still. It didn't begin with the Colosseum, or even with the word Colosseum, which, by the way, isn't its real name. The Romans called it the Flavian Amphitheater. Colosseum only came later, probably because of a giant statue of Nero that stood awkwardly nearby. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before the giant ovals of stone and sand, there were wooden structures, temporary stages, hastily assembled planks nailed together just long enough to host a blood-soaked weekend. The earliest Roman spectacles weren't even about lions and tigers. They were about funerals. Yes, because of course they were. Nothing says dignified farewell to my dead father like a few prisoners of war hacking each other to pieces in front of the mourners. This tradition started around the 3rd century BCE. Wealthy Roman families wanted to honor their ancestors in a way that was both memorable and expensive. Hiring flute players was too ordinary, so instead, they decided to honor the dead by staging combat. The logic was that blood sacrifice somehow appeased the spirits of the deceased, which is either deeply spiritual or a very creative excuse to turn grief into an afternoon's entertainment. At first, it was small, 2 men fighting beside the funeral pyre, then maybe 4. By the late Republic, ambitious families were putting on full-scale shows, bringing in dozens of gladiators, imported animals, and hired trainers. The funerals got so extravagant that the Senate naturally had to step in. Because if there's one thing Rome's Senate liked less than innovation, it was innovation that made senators look poor compared to their rivals. So decrees were passed, limits were set. Only so many gladiators could be displayed at a time, which of course meant that families immediately began competing to find loopholes. The result: more blood, more crowds, and more demand. Now the Romans were nothing if not practical. They realized these funeral games were popular, which meant they could be co-opted for politics. Why leave the honor of gladiatorial shows to wealthy families when elected officials could stage them too, conveniently before an election? A few dozen well-timed lion hunts, and suddenly, the crowd was cheering your name instead of your rivals. This is where the Senate's decrees gave way to something else: the slow construction of purpose-built venues. At first, wooden amphitheaters went up for special occasions. They were temporary, dismantled after a few weeks, but even then, the logistics were staggering. Think about it. You're a Roman magistrate trying to win public favor. You need to import fighters, feed them, stage the bouts, and, most complicated of all, ship exotic animals thousands of miles across the Mediterranean without them dying en route. Naturally, corners were cut. Records mention leopards arriving half dead, elephants too sick to stand, and crocodiles that refuse to perform on schedule. Nothing disappoints a Roman crowd quite like a sullen crocodile. By the late Republic, wooden arenas weren't enough. They burned down. They collapsed. Occasionally, they killed more spectators than gladiators, which wasn't great for morale. Rome needed permanence. And so, stone amphitheaters began to rise. One of the first major ones was built in Pompeii around 70 BCE. If you visit today, it still sits there, quiet, remarkably intact, with its rows of stone benches staring down at an oval of grass. Once upon a time, it was loud. But Pompeii gives us a perfect freeze frame. The walls still carry ancient graffiti scratched by enthusiastic fans, names of favorite gladiators, crude sketches of men with swords, and, in one very Roman touch, political slogans urging people to vote for a certain candidate, because even in graffiti, politics crept in. The Senate, meanwhile, kept trying to regulate the games, but by now the spectacles had slipped out of their control. Popular demand was too strong. Julius Caesar himself got involved, building temporary arenas in Rome to cement his popularity. Of course, Caesar always liked a bit of theater. For him, the games were less about honoring the dead and more about honoring Caesar. Then came Augustus. Ever the careful image manager, Augustus understood the power of spectacle. He didn't just host games, he used them to present himself as Rome's benevolent father. Bread, circuses, and the reassuring presence of a man who pretended not to be king while behaving very much like one. Augustus had arenas built, permanent ones. He issued new laws to regulate gladiators. He made the games a civic institution. What had once been a grim funeral rite had now become state entertainment. No longer blood for the ancestors. Now it was blood for Rome. And with that shift, arenas went from scattered wooden stages to enduring monuments in stone. Across the empire, cities competed to build amphitheaters of their own. North Africa, Gaul, Spain, even Britain. If you wanted to prove your city was truly Roman, you built an arena. Preferably one large enough to terrify the locals into remembering who was in charge. Which brings us back eventually to the Colosseum, commissioned by Vespasian in 72 CE, completed under his son, Titus. Financed, as historians like to point out, with loot taken from the sack of Jerusalem. Nothing like funding a tourist attraction with the spoils of conquest. It wasn't just entertainment, it was architecture as propaganda. The message was clear. Rome was eternal. Rome was powerful. Rome could not only conquer nations, but also build stone bowls big enough to hold 50,000 people and make them cheer in unison. And, naturally, it was all sanctioned by the Senate. What had begun as a handful of duels beside funeral pyres had turned into an empire-wide tradition, enshrined in stone, endorsed by law, and celebrated by citizens who were, perhaps, a little too enthusiastic about watching other people die.